So as we discussed in the last episode, the first step on our lease accounting journey is to determine whether a contract we've signed either includes or is itself a lease. Now, a majority of the time, this will be a relatively easy step. Leases are extremely common in business, and indeed, even FASB stated in their basis for conclusions when creating ASC 842 that in the board's view, assessing whether a lease exists will be straightforward in most cases. A contract will either fail to meet or will clearly meet the definition of a lease without the need for significant judgment. And if you're certain you have a lease covered by ASC 842 and simply want to learn how to account for it, feel free to skip this video. But ASC 842 does dedicate over 25 paragraphs and a good chunk of the implementation guidance to the determination of whether a contract is or is not a lease. So we do have some details to cover to ensure we're applying the standard correctly. So let's begin with the most basic. FASB defines a lease very clearly. ASC 842 1015-3 states that a contract is or contains a lease if the contract conveys the right to control the use of identified property, plant, or equipment, an identified asset, for a period of time in exchange for consideration. And it goes on to state that a period of time may be described in terms of the amount of use of an identified asset. So while the lease could be for 6 months or a year or 10 years or any time frame, it could also be for certain use. So you could lease a vehicle for 100,000 miles or something like that. Now, in this definition, the phrase right to control the use of an identified asset is doing a lot of heavy lifting. What exactly does it mean for us to have the right to control the use? FASB spends quite a bit of time on this, and we're not going to go through all of that detail in this episode, because for most contracts, this assessment is pretty straightforward. But we do have a few supporting videos if you want a deeper dive. For now, let's look at the two core ideas the standard focuses on. In ASC 842 1015-4, the paragraph right after the definition of a lease, FASB states that to determine right to control, we need to assess two things. First, does the customer have the right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from use of the identified asset? And two, does the customer have the right to direct the use of the identified asset? So these are the key concepts to understand. We have a lease if the contract conveys the right to control the use of an identified asset for a period of time. And to have the right to control, two things must be true. We need the right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from using the asset, and we need the right to direct how and for what purpose the asset is used. And if you want a deeper dive on those two criteria, we have supporting videos to this episode for each. Now, included in ASC 842 is some implementation guidance that does a nice job of summarizing this evaluation of a lease. In fact, it's the very first paragraph in the implementation guidance, ASC 842 1055-1. And it depicts the steps we need to go through to identify whether a contract is or contains a lease. And it looks like this. Given that we're focused on lessee accounting in this series, let's walk through this from the lessee's perspective, the customer to the contract. Step 1 is to determine whether there is an identified asset. Next, we look at whether we, as the customer, obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from using that asset. And if we do, we move on to the third question. Do we have the right to direct how and for what purpose the asset is used? If we answer yes to that, we've identified a lease. Now, if the use of the asset is predetermined by the contract, then we need to go through a couple more questions. These scenarios are less common, but ASC 842 includes detailed examples in the implementation guidance that walk through these edge cases. We'll cover those in a supporting video so you can see how the guidance applies in practice. Now, before we wrap up, we need to touch on one final point. The standard does lay out a few specific situations where a contract may meet the definition of a lease, but still fall outside the scope of ASC 842 and be accounted for under other guidance. In ASC 842 1015-1, FASB notes that because a lease involves the right to control the use of identified property, plant, or equipment, the guidance does not apply to several types of arrangements. These include leases of intangible assets, leases to explore for or use minerals, oil, natural gas, and similar resources, leases of biological assets such as timber, leases of inventory, and leases of assets under construction. If a contract falls into any of these categories, it is accounted for under a different topic and not under ASC 842. But as FASB itself states, in most cases the assessment of whether you have a contract that contains a lease should be relatively straightforward. And in the vast majority of cases it will be accounted for under ASC 842. So in the next video, we'll move on to step 2 in our process and look at how to separate the lease and non-lease components of a contract.